Join me tonight, Ecclesiastes chapter number 7. Ecclesiastes chapter number 7, as we've been working our way through this chapter. And we just finished up the sermon, If We Know What's Best for Us, out of chapter 7, verses 1 through 10, as he gave us all these different keys to understanding how to live our lives if we know what's best for us. And so he moves on now to give us some wisdom for working through this life. And so Ecclesiastes chapter number 7 is where we're at. And we'll read tonight verses 11 through 18 and finish also those verses, God willing. So chapter number 7, remember he's just finished talking about if we know what's best for us, we will not pine for the past. So now he moves on to a new section. And note what he says in verse number 11. Wisdom is good with an inheritance, and by it, the inheritance, there is profit to them that see the sun. For wisdom is a defense, and money is a defense, but the excellency of knowledge is that wisdom giveth life to them that have it. Consider the work of God. For who can make that straight which he hath made crooked? In the day of prosperity, be joyful, but in the day of adversity, consider. God also hath set the one over against the other, to the end that man should find nothing after him. All things have I seen in the days of my vanity. There is a just man that persisteth in his righteousness, and there is a wicked man that perisheth in his righteousness, and there is a wicked man that prolongeth his life in his wickedness. Be not righteous over much, neither make thyself over wise. Why shouldest thou destroy thyself? Be not overmuch wicked, neither be thou foolish. Why shouldest thou die before thy time? It is good that thou shouldest take hold of this. Yea, also from this withdraw not thine hand. For he that feareth God shall come forth of them all. This evening we want to speak about wisdom for walking through this life. So read this passage. It's indicative of the different experiences we have in this life and how they take place. And as I thought about my daughters when we would go to Oceanside, California, probably one of our favorite places on earth. That's not saying much. We haven't been to a lot of places, but one of our favorite places on earth, Oceanside, California. And we've taken all three of our girls there since they were younger. We'd take them there, and it never failed. They would go and they'd sit on the sand when they were old enough to stand upright or carry a shovel, and they'd stand there, and the water wouldn't quite reach up to them. And then as the water would come in a little bit, as the hours would draw on, it'd get up a little bit to their waist. And this kind of would in and out and in and out. They'd keep playing and whatnot, and inevitably the waves would come in and out. And then suddenly what would happen? A larger wave would come in, and all of a sudden it would hit their back because they'd be turned towards us, hit their back, and we always would chuckle because it was a shock to them. They'd be like, they'd stand up real quick and stand up, and now it's here at their waist, and it had shocked them. It had startled them. They'd been settled in small waves, and all of a sudden there's a large wave, and it would startle them to the point that they would jump up and just have the most horrified look of shock on their face. But you know what they do? In a few minutes, it'd settle right back down in that spot, and that process would go again, the waves coming up on them, and all of a sudden a big wave, and they would just get up, shocked like it had happened, and then, and all day at the ocean like this, my friends, just all day, back and forth, always stunned that one wave would come and dare to try to overtake them, and so that would happen. Well, in a similar fashion tonight, Solomon wants to guard us against such reactions in our own life. There'll be times, if I can say it this way, of the small waves. And they come up, and they don't really do anything to us in our minds. They don't really bother us. They don't really grieve us that much. But then there's times in life where the waves rush over us, if you will. So how are we to manage? If there's going to be times of small waves, there's going to be times of medium waves, there's going to be times of large waves that startle us, make us want to jump up real quick because we weren't expecting them. How are we to manage? And that's what Solomon talks about tonight out of Ecclesiastes 7, 11 through 18. Solomon calls us to view life's opportunities through God's viewpoint. We need God's insight to understand wealth, times of providence, and how to balance our lives. One person said it like this way: one of the marks of maturity is the ability to look at life in the perspective and not get out of balance. When you have God's wisdom, you'll be able to accept and deal with the changing experiences of life. So tonight, may we look together at a little bit of wisdom for walking through this life. The big waves, the small waves. How can God help us, or how can we align ourselves to be helped of God in walking through this life? Well, first thought is we need God's wisdom to view our wealth. We need God's wisdom to view our wealth. Look at verse number 11. Wisdom is good with an inheritance, and by it there is profit to them that see the sun. Verse number 12. For wisdom is a defense, and money is a defense, but the excellency of knowledge is that wisdom giveth life to them that have it. So we want to look at wisdom's view of wealth. The very first thought he gives us there is that we need wisdom to understand that money can be a great tool. In verse number 11, he speaks about a hypothetical situation, but also one that's very realistic, perhaps. Someone receives an inheritance, and this sudden windfall of material goods or money has a certain level of power associated with it and opportunity associated with it to be able to change one's life. Now, how the receiver handles the windfall can produce either great help or it can produce what? Great harm in their life. So note what Solomon says is needed. Wisdom. Wisdom is good with an inheritance. Not inheritances are good. Now, all of us would immediately want to read it that way, right? Inheritances, they're good. That's what we'd be glad to have. But he says, no, understand. You need wisdom. That's good with an inheritance. Remember, Solomon has not preached against money in the study, but what has he done? He has cautioned us about the usage of it or the power we give it in our lives. So what is being emphasized is the fact that wisdom, that's agreeable, that's pleasant, that's rather to be desired than just an inheritance by itself. If we receive an inheritance, if we receive some kind of monetary goods or earthly possessions, then may we also recognize our great need of wisdom to go along with it. Why? Because note what he says. Wisdom is good with an inheritance, and by it there is profit to them that see the sun. When you pair God's wisdom with any type of material wealth or gain or possession, an inheritance as it's being fashioned in this passage, it grants you the ability to be of profit to yourself, God, and others. It grants you this opportunity to be profitable. This idea is here of something being superior, something that has an advantage for the receiver, maybe possibly those around them. Hence why he says, them that see the sun. He's saying, if you get an inheritance and you will ask for God's help and wisdom with this wealth, you now have at your disposal the opportunity to be the greatest help to them that are alive around you. The inheritance can be a great tool to benefit the receiver and those around them immediately, but also in future years to come. That possibility cries for one to need and to have wisdom to effectively utilize the inheritance. And so he says, wisdom with money can be a great tool. But he goes on to say this, wisdom and money both may offer protection, but wisdom protects regardless. So note what he says in verse 12. Wisdom is the defense, and money is the defense, but the excellency of knowledge is that wisdom giveth life to them that have it. He continues here by showing that both wisdom and wealth offer a certain level of stability, security, and protection. The word here for defense indicates a shadow over something or someone, a proactive protection by someone, proactive protection by something, whether it be a rooftop, whether it be somebody more powerful, whatever it may be. Solomon is highlighting the superiority of having wisdom regardless of wealth. Because somebody may say, well, I never had this inheritance to even use or ask for wisdom, because if I had it, I'd ask for wisdom, Pastor. That's what I do. Give me some money, I'll ask for wisdom. That's how this would work. But Solomon debunks that, hey, you don't need to have the inheritance to have wisdom, and you shouldn't put all your eggs in the basket of inheritance or wealth. He says, because wisdom is a defense and money is a defense. They may be able to provide some level of protection or security for you. But he said, listen, the only thing that will last beyond that would be wisdom, not the money. So he says that's why it is excellent to have the knowledge that wisdom has a far more valuable and enduring possibility than just money by itself. That's why he says that's the excellency of this knowledge. What's best to know from Solomon? That wisdom gives life. It grants the receiver of it great protection and preservation through the course of one's life here on earth. Wisdom can preserve you even when money is long gone. One author put it like this: money can lose its value or be stolen, but true wisdom keeps its value and cannot be lost unless we become foolish and abandon it deliberately. So Solomon says here, the excellency of knowledge, what's good to know, what's best to know is not inheritances, not even just how to use inheritances, but what's best to know is that you need and can have wisdom from God, because it will help you in this life, it will help you with those around you. And so when you view your wealth, may we not be tied down to it, may we not be attached to it, may we look at it as what it is, something that needs God's help to utilize and manage properly. And even if we don't have in our mind a great amount of wealth, may we still treasure and value the wisdom of God in our life. That is enduring. And so, when we go through these experiences of life, whether you have no money or you have a copious amounts of money, I need wisdom with our wealth. But then he moves on to give us an understanding that we need also as we go through the experiences of life. We need wisdom to view God's providence in our life. Wisdom to view God's providence in our life. Note what he says there in verse number 13. Consider the work of God, for who can make that straight which he hath made crooked? Solomon moves on from talking about, well, here's how you should view your wealth. You should view your wealth through the lens of needing God's wisdom, regardless of how little or how much you have. Wisdom's the baseline you need. But he says, but then you need wisdom in viewing God's providence in your life and in the lives of those around you. And so he begins by saying, it is foolish to fight against God's working taking place around us. Solomon calls upon his readers to contemplate who is really in charge of what takes place around them. Note how he begins verse number 13. Consider the work of God. The word consider here means to examine something, to inspect it. It's the idea of giving pause to really take in what's in front of you. Maybe I could just add some southern speak here and say, it's like the idea of stewing or mulling it over, right? Colloquialisms, lost sometimes, right? You're just going to take some time. You're not going to move too quickly on that. You're going to really contemplate what's in front of you. And Solomon says, now pause and think about the work of God, the deeds and activities taking place under the care of the Almighty. Before we'd say, oh yeah, I think about the works of God, Solomon says, no, before we pass this by, pause. God in heaven, the creator of all that is under the sun, that God, Solomon wants us to pause and think about, is active. I fear sometimes in all my planning, inspecting, and doing, I'm guilty of not starting with that thought. The thought that I have a God in heaven who is active. And he's been active before it was even on my idea or my thoughts to pause to consider anything. My God has been active. What holy slowness should come over us before we proceed with plans about us without taking place here first, this considering. Now, somebody would step back and say, wow, man, Pastor, you make plans and sometimes act upon plans without considering the work of God? That's shameful. I don't do that. You may step back and say, oh, Pastor, I always consider the work of God before I make any decisions about what's going on around me. I hate to burst your bubble, but Solomon doesn't believe you. Oh, Pastor, that's what I do. Solomon doesn't believe you. You say, how do you know? Look at verse 13. Consider the work of God. Because then he asks us a question. For who can make that straight which he hath made crooked? How do I know Solomon doesn't believe us if we'd say, I always consider the work of God before I always pause, Pastor, before I do anything? Solomon asks us this question. By asking the question, it indicates that most of us are really, really ready to help God out in matters rather than receive his help, rather than pause and reflect and ask for his help. Bridges said this, yet there are many things crooked in man's eyes because they cross his own will and thwart his own imaginary happiness. What is Solomon saying? We are prone to want to straighten out that which looks crooked to us. The activities going around us that are taking place around us in life, we're prone to want to straighten them out to as we think they ought to be. And yet God's viewpoint is this. They're already straight. They're already straight in his economy. They're already straight in his timetable. They're already straight in his doings. And we need wisdom to view his providence in the affairs of this life. So he says, who can make that straight which he hath made crooked? Obviously, the word crooked here is not indicating perverseness, but his economy, his doings, his desires don't automatically line up with ours. And sometimes we are fighting the plans and proactivity of God. And Solomon says this, before you get worked up about your plans, you need to pause and ask for God's wisdom in viewing his providential dealings around you, because it is very foolish to fight against God's work around us. But then he goes on to his second declaration, which is, it is wise to accept God's dealings with us. Note what he says in verse 14. In the day of prosperity, be joyful. But in the day of adversity, here's that same Hebrew word again, consider. Solomon speaks of two kinds of times in life and two responses we should embrace. Now, the first time is one we all like to read about. And Solomon says you can have this, and it's a good thing. He says, have this day of prosperity in the ebbs and flows of life, in the experiences of life, in the providence of God even, working around you, the straight and the crooked. He will give you and I days of prosperity. The phrase here indicates good things, things that make us happy. Conditions that are beneficial in our mind or to our desires. God's going to give us those times. Isn't that something Solomon has stated throughout this? You're going to have times in life that are very, very pleasing and enjoyable. And it's not wrong. It's not bad. You don't have to walk around with a sourpuss attitude all the time about anything good in life. You don't have to, well, no, it's fine. It's good. There's going to be days of prosperity. But there's also going to be days of adversity. What's this word for adversity? Evil and wickedness, in the sense of it being perpetrated upon you by someone else. These days of adversity would include an event that brings you great loss or misfortune. Circumstances that bring you distress. Circumstances that cause you some level of injury or misery. Solomon tells us we're most likely going to have times of both. Human life, generally speaking, has good and bad days. Ebbs and flow, in and out. Times of plenty, times of lean, happy times, sad times, times of ease, times of difficulty. With such times being mostly guaranteed to all of us in this life, Solomon gives us two responses to embrace. Be joyful and consider. Hey, when you have that day of prosperity, it's okay to be joyful. Literally, filled with joy about how things are. Merry, lighthearted. You're very pleased with how things are going. There's nothing wrong with enjoying life. You know, I fear too often we're a little bit too quick to be dour about something. Some people are always struggling to enjoy something good because they think that good is a sign of something bad about to happen. I can remember one individual we ministered to in California. They would always say this. Anytime something good, like, hey, I got a new job. Oh, praise the Lord. But I'm just waiting for the other shoe to drop. What do you mean? He'd go on to say, Things are a little too good right now. Got the new job. I'm wondering if the car's going to break down. The first time he said it, I thought he was just kind of like, ha, 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 ha. No, he was serious. Anytime things went well, he took it as a sign that something by default is coming down the pike to not do well. And he would just not be able to enjoy. He was paralyzed in a joyful day. Instead of being joyful in that day of prosperity, he was just dreading, biting nails, waiting for something awful to happen. But he says here, in the days of prosperity, be joyful. That's a good thing. But when things are difficult, he doesn't say you have to walk around with a chipper smile on your face and just clicking your heels and walking down the street, arms out, swaying like nothing's problematic, no weight on you in the world. What does he call us to do? He calls us to that same word again. Consider. Hey, when things are difficult, reflect on God's work in your life. Isn't that what he just told us to do in verse 13? Consider the work of God. In the day of prosperity, be joyful. It's the work of God. But in the day of adversity, when things are not that good, consider the work of God. Pause, my friend, and consider him. Why? Because note what he says in verse number 14. God also has set the one over against the other to the end that man should find nothing after them. God has set them side by side, in other words, to remind us that we don't know what comes next or comes after us. God, in his providence, knows what's taking place in our life, and he does allow the days of prosperity, but he will also allow and maybe even instigate or orchestrate in our life the days of adversity. As one author said, God does not allow us to know whether tomorrow will bring unexpected wealth or sudden calamity, but we can find peace if we accept it all as from God. May we remember this evening, God set both times. Can we also thank the Lord this evening that the author mentions them as days to indicate the brevity of duration in regards to the entirety of our life. Note, he didn't say the 50 years of prosperity and the 2 years of adversity, or vice versa, 50 years of adversity and just 2 days of prosperity. He indicates, in reality, the times of prosperity and the times of adversity, they will be balanced out, and in the scope of your life here on this earth, they are very brief. And second, can I remind us, both responses can take place in light of who God is. You can be joyful in the day of adversity because of what is going on around you, but more importantly, because of who the author is of that day of prosperity. But then by default, we can be reflective, and we can pause, and we can consider what is taking place around us in the day of adversity, and also thank the one who is the author, contemplating his goodness and his mercy even in the day of adversity. You know, it's been said, no matter how much experience we have in the Christian life or how many books we've read, we must still walk by faith each day. Even, friends, when it comes to wealth, we need God's wisdom. But when it comes to his providence in our life, when it's good, when it's bad, pause. Consider the work of your God. When it's time to be joyful, be joyful. When it's times of adversity, take time to pause and think about who your God is. So lastly this evening, he wants us to have wisdom to view balance in this life. To view to have the right balance in this life. Note what he says in verse number 15. All things have I seen in the days of my vanity. There's a just man that perisheth in his righteousness, and there's a wicked man that prolongeth his life in his wickedness. Solomon begins by stating something else he's observed in his life. Bad things happen to good people. Good things happen to bad people. And so why does God allow the righteous to suffer? And why, in our perception, does he sometimes allow the wicked to live lavishly? Solomon says that such a view is easily observed. If you haven't noticed that already in your life, you will at some point. It seems like, quote, the bad things happen to good people and vice versa. Yet, Solomon's reminding us that we need his wisdom, God's wisdom, to see it from the proper viewpoint, because when we look at it and think that, that is the short view of life. Wisdom calls us to fear God and remember his doings as stated in the previous verse. And we might be tempted to think ill of the Lord if we think this is the reality exclusively. You can try to live righteously and perish, and you can try to live wickedly and be prolonged in your life, get to, quote, enjoy that more. But Bridges wisely notes this: if the wicked prolongeth his days, continuing in sin, surely the very sight of him excites not our envy, but our deepest compassion. What is he saying? He's saying when you and I look out there and we see what Solomon saw, which is the wicked seeming to do well and the righteous not seeming to do well, may we pause and remember our God's providence is at work, and we need his help to have a balanced view of this life. Not envious of sinners and not begrudging of our holy God's desire on our life, but recognizing, wait a minute, I can trust my God and his providence, and I can go forward no matter how it looks. And so I need his wisdom to balance this out as I go forward and as young people follow behind me, viewing the same things as universal to humanity. But then he says, avoid unrealistic and unbiblical expectations of God. Unbiblical and unrealistic expectations of God. Note what he says in verse 16. Be not righteous over much, neither make thyself over wise. Why shouldest thou destroy thyself? Now, I'm not going to lie. I was talking to Pastor David about this today. These next 3 verses, I'll just tell you, nobody agrees about any of it. That's always a blessing as a pastor. You say, you've said that a lot in Ecclesiastes. It isn't happening a lot in Ecclesiastes. Nobody really agrees about the structure of the Hebrew, or maybe even the interpretation thereof. But what's generally accepted is what I think we shall go with this evening. Verse number 16. Be not righteous over much, neither make thyself over wise. Why shouldest thou destroy thyself? On the surface, when we read this verse, we might incorrectly evaluate Solomon as saying not to be zealous for righteousness and wisdom. If we read this, we may get that impression. But immediately we understand that that cannot be the case, because he's been championing the opposite just earlier, right? It's a good thing to live a righteous life. It's a good thing to appeal to God for wisdom. What is being stated is this: due to the reality of verses 13 and 15 through 15, do not think that if you live as righteous as you possibly can and try to get all the wisdom you can get, that you have secured rest and only good all the days of your life. Solomon says that living under such aesthetic ideas would eventually lead you to ruin and destruction. And this person who would live this way is concerned with a philosophy of life that seeks the benefits of long life, prosperity, and personal happiness through the strict observation of religious duties unto God. You say, what are you saying? This person who says, well, I don't want this life to have any ills, so if I'll just live the most perfect life possible, the most righteous life, I'll be zealous for righteousness, and I will do everything I can to get as much wisdom as possible and operate upon that, then I will not suffer any of the calamities that take place around me. So I'm going to be zealous for righteousness. I'm going to be zealous for wisdom. And Solomon says, don't think that way, because you'll destroy yourself. Why? Because this kind of mindset, this group who would think this way, begins to view God in heaven as their ideal life dispenser. They put in a quarter of the church time. You guys remember the old machines? It's like a way of the dodo. Some of you adults will know this. Kids are like, why do quarters? Why would I do that when I have a phone? Okay, back in the day, there were these machines. You'd put quarters in. They'd either dispense prizes or you play arcade games. You had to pay a quarter. Crazy, right? Some could say even a nickel now, right? And so some people treat God that way. You know those crane games? I'm going to put in a quarter of church attendance, and now, boom, nabbed me a promotion at work. I'm going to take a quarter of zealous, righteous living, and I'm going to put some money in the plate. Boom, God will not let my car break down now. And Solomon says, don't live with that idea. Such a view is ultimately unhealthy and destructive because it is unrealistic and unbiblical. Pastor, you're telling me if I live for God, there's no blessing and or reward, but the Scriptures have promised, and they have promised. Is God your provider? Yes, He is. Is there comfort and rest with the Lord and peace and joy? Yes, there are. But we don't zealously pursue righteousness and wisdom to try to remove any ill or calamity from our life, because that's unrealistic and it is unbiblical. Because something that you think ought to be straight, God in heaven says might need to be what? By your eyes, a little crooked. It may be a little like this. And for you to sit there, or for me to sit there and say, I'm going to be zealous for righteousness and wisdom, I'm just going to do everything I can to try to avoid any of those providential moments. Solomon says, no, that's an imbalanced view of life. And you need God's wisdom to realize that is unrealistic and is an unbiblical expectation of God. He is not the ideal life dispenser. He's not your idol or my idol to get the perfect life now. Is that not most of Christianity's problem in America right now? Seeking a God who gives you everything you want, how you wanted, when you wanted, with no ill in between, or is always taking your ill to make it your best. You know, a little Lakewood there. That's not healthy. It's unrealistic and it's unbiblical. But then Solomon gives us the other side of the coin. Avoid indulgence or a casual attitude towards sin. Well, somebody might step back and say, well, if I'm just as righteous as possible, I'll be insulated from it. But then somebody may be tempted for verse 17. Be not overmuch wicked, neither be thou foolish. Why shouldest thou die before thy time? Again, on the surface, one might think Solomon is condoning some level of wicked living as long as it's not overly wicked. Again, that would be antithetical to his other teachings. He is warning of the opposite mindset. If you think I'll live super righteous and I will just run after wisdom to be insulated from any ill, he's saying, may I warn you about the other ditch on the other side of the road, which is a casual attitude. Well, in verse 15, if the righteous perish and the wicked live long, and I can't insulate myself fully from calamity, I guess a little indulgence or casuality never hurt anybody. I mean, if the righteous are not spared, then I might just have this attitude that I give myself a space of indulgence, because after all, no one is perfect. They look at the reality of verse 15 and say, if that's what holy living gets you, then I'll live not really wicked, but I will give myself a space of indulgence on a particular sins or set of unholiness that suits me or pleases me. Thus, they view God in heaven as some kind of permissive, I should say maybe a grandfather, permissive of their wicked behavior. Solomon says that would be an imbalanced view as well. To think you can avoid any calamity by dotting all the I's and crossing all the T's, and therefore you've done your part for God and He owes you now, is equally as foolish as saying, well, if that's what the righteous get, and I won't be overly wicked to get destruction, I'll just be intemperate. I'll just be casual. I'll just have this attitude that I can live how I want, and I might as well, because if we're all going to die anyway and the wicked get to enjoy it, I might be able to get by with some more than I really don't have to give up that much. Solomon gives both sides of this ditch on the sides of the road. And in verse 16, he says, you destroy yourself on the one side with unrealistic and unbiblical expectations of God, and because of an unholy and casual and apathetic attitude towards God and sin, he says, you'll die before your time. Far too many Christians, I fear, fall into one of these two ditches, don't they? What do you mean, Pastor? The first ditch, God, I'll give, I attend, I read, I pray. And we think that entitles us to no ill will in our life. The second ditch is, I'll serve God on my own terms. And I'll think there'll be no ramifications for that. Both are wrong. Both are imbalanced. Both are to our peril, friends. Solomon is telling us, you don't want to be in verse 16 type of mindset or verse 17 type of mindset. We need God's help to view life in the proper balance. So what does he say as he ends in verse 18? be gripped by God in these matters, not griped at Him in our lives. Note what he says in verse 18. It is good that thou shouldest take hold of this. Yea, also from this withdraw not thine hand. For he that feareth God shall come forth of them all. When he says, it's good that thou shouldest take hold of this, many believe he is talking about everything I've just said in verses 11 through 18 to us, verses 11 through 18. He says, you need to take hold of this. The word literally means to seize, to grasp something, to take possession of something. Almost this doggedness, you're not going to let go at all. It kind of reminded me the Hebrew word here of when an alligator clamps down on something. Maybe you've gotten to see him in person if you'd been down to Florida or somewhere of that nature, and you've seen an alligator perhaps like that, snatched down. Looked up on Google, thank you Google, 2,100 PSI. Can you imagine that? Can you imagine that? Put it in perspective, the human jaw, 120. Yeah, human jaw, 120, alligator, 2,100. That alligator latches on, and what does he do? Begins to twirl and to roll and go down, and he will not let go. She will not let go for anything. Solomon says, that's what you need to have. How long should these truths about needing God's help in wealth, needing God's help in this issue of His providence in our life and His help in viewing life in balance, how long should I hold on to these? Well, he says, hold on to them and withdraw not thy hand. The word withdraw gives a sense of coming to rest or having inactivity. The use of the word hand indicates our labor or work with something. So Solomon says not to cease employing these truths in our lives. Latch on to them. Don't get lax. Don't get restful about them. Don't get inactive in employing or using them. They are to be what guide us and direct us through the experiences of life. Why? Because he ends the verse by saying, he that feareth God shall come forth of them all. You see, we don't have to live a life of imbalance on either side, on the ditch of verse 15 or verse 16. And fighting against God in verses 13 and 14, and foolishly using our wealth the way we want to in verses 11 and 12. Why? Because we've been free from both. God in heaven wants to help us escape the grasp of both. We don't have to chide with God about what's going on in our life. We don't have to gripe at Him about the wealth we have or don't have. We don't have to gripe at Him about the providence and the way He's working in our lives and around our lives. We don't have to have an inaccurate view of God's economy in our lives. We can be gripped by Him, by His providence. We can have a beginning place of wisdom. He said, he that feareth God. See, my friends, for us to have wisdom, to walk us through this life with wealth, with providence, with a proper view, a balanced view of this life and its affairs and our God, it starts back there. He that feareth God. To fear God is to find the place of humility before Him, to know your place before Him, to know your frailty before Him. When you and I fear God, we understand who He rightfully is in the Scriptures and who we are as His needy creation. We may be made in His image, and we may even be, if we're believers, the righteousness of God in Christ Jesus and have been given all things in regards to life and godliness, 2 Peter 1. But we still need to what? Humbly acknowledge our need of His grace to accomplish anything. You see, we don't get to do it on our own. We need His wisdom. We need Him when the small waves come as much as we do when we have the big waves overtake us. We don't want to rest and settle into a viewpoint that would not match up with us. Tonight, my friends, Solomon indirectly asks us to consider what type of wisdom we're walking through this life with. He calls us to view life's opportunities through God's viewpoint. And may you and I be willing tonight to recognize our need of His help in regards to wealth, His providential dealings with us, and then a balanced view of Him, us, and the life He's allowing around us. This evening, there is wisdom to walk through this life. Small waves, big waves, and everything in between. And may we not be overwhelmed. There'll be times it will be stunning because we didn't know it was coming, but we can always come back to pause and consider the work of our God. When it may seem crooked to us, it's straight to Him, my friends. May we, in humility, fear Him and ask for His help through it. Father, would you help each of us tonight, each man and each woman, to have your wisdom in walking through this life? God, I know my own heart, how foolishly I go forward trying to make things straight that are straight to me and upset about what's not, and trying to change this and not stopping to consider the work of my God. So I do ask tonight that you'd help us. Help each man, each woman, each young person in this room this evening to recognize how quick we are sometimes to let wealth become something that binds us rather than a tool utilized for you. How quickly we are to be bothered and argumentative with your providence in our lives, then how much we need your wisdom to guard us against imbalance in the way we view you and our life that you've given us. May we tonight recognize there's wisdom available. We don't have to go it alone. We don't have to try it alone. We don't have to try to manufacture it. You've given us your help. But will we, in humility, fear you to accept it? Lord, help each of us tonight. I don't know what you've highlighted in the hearts of individuals, but they do right now with your Spirit. May we be willing to confess, align with you, agree with your word, and move forward about this situation in faith. And we ask this in Christ's name. Amen. I want you to take a moment with your heads bowed and eyes closed, and we'll have the piano play. And as it does this evening, with our heads bowed, our eyes closed, I don't know what's taking place in your life, but I would invite and ask you to consider whatever it is. Where's your God in that equation? Where are you in regards to your God in that equation? Are you walking in His wisdom, or are you struggling against Him, fighting against Him? Are you opposed to Him by trying to accomplish it your own way? Frustrated about Him because of a wrong and balanced view? Tonight, our heads are bowed, our eyes are closed. Let's take a moment to consider the Word. Appreciate your faithfulness this evening. I want to remind all the Awana workers of your meeting immediately following the service tonight. And so as soon as we are dismissed, if you wouldn't mind going to the Mosaic room. So if you're an Awana worker, we need you there for that. I'm going to dismiss Brother Rob at this time so you can go back and be ready and prepared for that. So I want to encourage you to be back there. If you are going to be an Awana worker, you need to be at this meeting, all right, to be a help to us with that right after tonight. The service. And then I want to remind you about something perhaps you already remember is For the Family Weekend starts this Friday, 7 o'clock. Goes from 7 to 7:45 for the first session, 8 to 8:45 for the second. We're done for that evening. Then Saturday is 10 and through 11. Those are both split sessions, a lunch, and then one session right after that. Then Sunday, every Bible study class is combined in here, adults that is, from teens up, 9:30. Right here in this sanctuary, and then 10:30, and then we'll have a lunch on the grounds. If you can bring a dessert, that's what we're asking you to do. That'd be just fine. A dessert for the lunch afterwards, and then an afternoon service immediately following that lunch. There'll be no evening service. So, service, lunch, service, done for the day. And so I want to encourage you to invite some friends or family. Maybe you know somebody who just got married, it would be helpful for them. Somebody who has kids, be helpful for them. Somebody raising grandkids, it'd be helpful for them. I want to encourage you to be out to that. You can see the Facebook announcement. Then we want to encourage you. Nothing helps promote something in our time, in our society, like organic Facebook or Twitter redoing it, rehashing. No, not hashing. What am I trying to say? Sharing. Thank you. Sharing it. Sharing it on Facebook, sharing it on Twitter, retweeting it on Twitter. I don't have an account, so I don't know how to do that. So do those kind of things. That'd be a help. Tomorrow I'm going to be inviting somebody, gasp, in person to it, and so I want to encourage you, do that. It would be a help to them. It's not just for the saved. It would be a great starting point to talk with somebody. It's going to be obviously Bible-based, but having a lot of gospel opportunity with those who are unsaved. Appreciate your faithfulness. We'll look forward to seeing you on Friday. Let's stand as we're dismissed in a song of praise with Brother Nate.
You can turn to page 230 in your hymnal, and we'll put Miss Lori on the spot here. So, page 230. Higher ground. I'm pressing on the upward way, new heights I'm gaining every day, still praying as I'm onward bound. Lord, plant my feet on higher ground. Lord, lift me up and let me stand by faith on heaven's tableland, a higher plane than I have found. Lord, plant my feet on higher. Verse 4. I want to scale the utmost height and catch a gleam of glory bright, but still I'll pray till heaven I found. Lord, lead me on to higher ground. Lord, lift me up and let me stand by faith on heaven's tableland, a higher plane than I have found. Lord, plant my feet on higher ground. Thank you for singing, and you are dismissed.